I once again went through an episode that showcases of what the character would have been like if only the new writers or the direction of the Loud House in the present didn't turn those characters into something we didn't like. Believe me, Jeers for Fears would have been a better episode, but considering that one of the characters from this really made this episode difficult to take itself seriously most of the time, even if that character only appeared briefly in this episode, it's literally one of the reasons onto why I don't take the characters having phobias seriously in these episodes. Granted, I did the fanfic involving the Loud House, but more on that later. In Jeers for Fears, Chandler and his friends are going to Warriorwood's House of Terror, which Lincoln and Clyde make a bet on going to the House of Terror, despite the fact that their phobias are over the top. So they get some assistance from Lucy and the sisters to tighten up in order to be prepared for the Warriorwood's House of Terror, but every single one of them failed because it's too difficult for Lincoln and Clyde to handle. In Fails from the Crypt, Ryan, along with her friends, are trying to break the record by staying in the cemetery despite going against Rosa's wishes. So to tell you the truth, the plots of two episodes are similar when it comes to the characters just trying to tighten up on against their fears or just trying to beat a record by staying in one location involving fears. But believe me when I say this, no matter how much I see Jeers for Fears being entertaining, the Casagrandes episode is the better episode. Way earlier, sure, but still, there's a lot more to discuss. The problems of the Loud House episode have nothing to do with the over-the-top phobias of Lincoln and Clyde being afraid of anything during the Halloween season, or anything terror-related. And I can totally understand why people may find that running gag really annoying, that really drags this episode down, especially since that they have the phobias as the series progresses, which they don't learn any lessons, mainly of Lincoln learning his lesson from the Price of Admission episode where he watches a scary movie, only to not learn that lesson in the Boss Maybe episode. But the biggest problem I have with this episode is Chandler himself. Yes, he doesn't appear a lot. I understand that he isn't a main character completely, but considering he's an obstacle in the same ways as in the waiting game, I really felt like that he was a lot more better here than he was in the waiting game, since that him along with his friends are just trying to one-up themselves against anyone by going to the House of Terror, and the fact that it's being rebuilt since that Lincoln and Clyde went through it thanks to Bobby showing them a play, showing them everything inside of the House of Terror. That is literally where the biggest highlight for me is when it comes to the motivations of Lincoln and Clyde. But when it came to future appearances involving Chandler, he's a much more different character in the future episodes than this, since that he has actual depth in this episode. Like, you can argue that in the waiting game, he was taking advantage of Lincoln, which leads to Lincoln taking advantage of his sister Lori. But to tell you the truth, this is the episode where he actually has depth in his character, considering that even though that he doesn't deserve anything bad in this episode, considering that he didn't do anything to Lincoln and Clyde, it still gave Lincoln and even Clyde character growth when it comes to them facing their fears. Because to tell you the truth, if Lincoln became friends with Chandler after this episode, while Chandler isn't how he was in the newer episodes, while Lincoln and Clyde still have their phobias, I would probably go against their characters a lot more than Chandler. Because to tell you the truth, when Chandler is resort to being back into a bully in the newest seasons, it really feels like that everything else in this episode just feels a lot more meaningless. But it's not the worst kind of meaningless in comparison to other good episodes. Now, the Casagrandes episode may center around breaking the record and the focus of a friend group staying in the cemetery while the parents forbid them, even if it's mainly Ryan's grandmother. is predictable, obviously, but it's somewhat relatable considering that if anyone is willing to go through a haunted house or a haunted maze or a cemetery, their parents would deny that completely, and they would definitely go behind their parents' backs in order to do what they want involving the season of Halloween or the terror around them. Though I have never been through a haunted cemetery or a haunted house when it comes to Halloween monsters, I can totally relate to Rosa being paranoid, considering that what she does in this episode just showcases of how much that she thinks ahead of time, which leads to the other characters thinking ahead of time. Like, you can argue that you may like Jeers for Fears a little bit more than this episode, but believe me when I say this, characters like Ryan and most of her friends like being terrified in a cemetery or being in a haunted house. Since that Ryan isn't acting the same way as Lincoln in the Loud House episode, really gives her more of a different motivation since that she's just trying to break the record along with her friends. And believe me when I say this, the fact that she is willing to go back there for a second time just showcases of how much that she is willing to take the risks again for the sake of her own amusement. And that amusement isn't part of selfishness. Because, to tell you the truth, if Rosa, Hector, Vito, and Sergio didn't keep up with scaring kids in the cemetery to keep the 40-year record streak, which is actually the reasonings of scaring kids in the cemetery, and they were replaced with different characters, then Ryan will probably act up like Lincoln and Clyde were from Jeers for Fears. Though, if you guys ever read or watched my fanfic reading of Over the Phobia Terror, you can tell that I didn't take Lincoln being brave seriously, mainly the fact that he kept his phobia forever. But the thing is, after watching all the episodes and the development of all the characters, even up until this point in the series, do you really think that Lincoln and Clyde are the people who are capable of overcoming their fears? Like, this episode may make you think that they're trying to improve themselves on overcoming their fears, but at the same time, they went through so much that it's difficult to control their phobias. Like, you can't argue that a few people who are like Lincoln and Clyde can control their phobias in real life. While I can't deny that Lincoln and Clyde aren't scaredy cats because they are, it doesn't change the fact that the fanfic that I made really showcases of how the characters are being put in a situation where they need to overcome their fears by any means necessary, even though at the end of the day, they go back to square one. I get that the show really revolves the characters' development way too much, but when it comes to fears, I'm actually sighing on the fact that the people who work on the show in the later seasons we started the development of Lincoln and Clyde from this episode. Because believe me when I say this, no matter how many times that the characters' development get reversed, feels aren't really much of a development when it comes to the world building of the Loud House. Since that this is part of the down-to-earth elements, and even in the fantasy elements, may have problems with the episodes and characters themselves, it doesn't change the fact that feels in the personalities of Lincoln and Clyde are basically part of their character, and I can understand that it may be over the top for people to take their characters seriously when they can't overcome their feels. It's not like that this is the worst thing that the people behind this show have done when it comes to reversing development. Though then again, that doesn't change the fact that this episode just isn't as good as it was 5 years ago due to how Chandler has changed. But let's get back to the Casagrandes episode. During Ryan's second visit to the cemetery, Rosa and the others tried to scare them off again, but then they heard more noises in the distance, which leads to more monsters coming into the cemetery, which isn't part of Rosa's plan whatsoever. They take them to the Crypt for shelter, only to reveal that in the vampire costume is Maria and in the werewolf costume is Carlos. Because Ryan, Sid, Maria, and Carlos learned that Rosa and the others were behind scaling them in the cemetery because of one of Rosa's foods that Sid found in the cemetery. In all honesty, there are multiple ways for the characters to find out, but to tell you the truth, considering that Rosa is a chef, it's really accurate. What's also accurate is that Maria and Carlos have this sibling rivalry that they had during childhood, and to tell you the truth, the fact that they're willing to work together in order to one up against their grandparents is really saying something. Seriously, why couldn't we have an episode focusing on the two? It would have been a lot more interesting, and it would have given Maria more character growth. I'm just saying, a lot of missed opportunities. Getting back on track, I felt like that what Rosa is dealing with in this episode isn't because of the safety of her grandchildren, since that she's overprotective, obviously, but the fact that nobody ever broken her 40-year record. 40 years she's been in the cemetery scaring children, and to be perfectly real with you, the fact that she is willing to scare Ryan and her friends for the sake of making sure that her record doesn't get break, while also during the first time they wanted to teach her grandchildren a lesson on not disobeying her orders, while the second is mainly everything backfiring on her. It really feels way more accurate to have Ryan turn the tables on Rosa to make Rosa understand that Ryan just wants to do something for herself, all the while not realizing the fact that Rosa was responsible with the scaling the monsters and the fog machines in the cemetery the first time, but when it came to the second time, Ryan doesn't mess around. When she catches on what's really going on, she instantly turns the tables on anyone. Granted, it may be debatable on the fact that people can't get over the fact that she still pranks Lincoln from time to time, but when it comes to anyone else, no one is safe from her. And let me tell you, as much as I try to appreciate the House of Terror sequence where it's being remade from the inside, since that they heard the criticisms from Lincoln and Clyde when Bobby gave them a tour inside, I really felt like that this would have been a lot more better if there was actual continuation from this episode, but since there isn't, it kind of makes everything else while good when it comes to Lincoln and Clyde beating Chandler and his friends at the end. In future episodes, it just ruined the goodwill of Chandler's character, because no matter how I see it, he isn't going to improve after how his development just ruins the goodwill of his likability and mostly sympathy in the future episodes. If you want to know onto why I made Chandler more devious and more selfish and more toxic in my fanfic over the Phobia Terror, is because if the show isn't taking the character seriously, then why should I, when I can just make him the antagonist? And to tell you the truth, Chandler's friends, even if I use one of them in my fanfic, aren't really his friends anymore after this episode, since we don't see them ever again. Which I'm going to assume that Chandler ended his relationships with them, or it's the other way around. But I can guarantee you that considering that Lincoln and Clyde are willing to not rat out Chandler and his friends by having everyone know that they're chickens, I can guarantee you that there is no hesitation of Chandler ratting Lincoln and Clyde out when he tells everyone at school that they're chickens, even after they escape the House of Terror without taking the bailout door. I really liked the potential from this episode. In fact, it gave me inspiration on doing the fanfic. But the thing is, the episode itself just loses the credibility of what the future seasons done to characters that make them worse than they were from this episode. Like, believe me when I say this, that when Chandler in the newer seasons are worse than the episode The Waiting Game, you can really tell that I really miss the potential of the Loud House. Because Since that the last Loud Tales vs. Casagrandes episode, well, the Loud Tales episode was the final episode where Chris Savino was part of, I was really expecting a lot more from the people who worked on the show, especially since that in the final episodes of Season 3 without Chris Savino, they did a good job. Sometimes there's a lot more factors that are way more important than this, but to tell you the truth, since that I have nothing against with the phobias still being part of Lincoln and Clyde's personalities, I'm really starting to convince that they would have gone somewhere with it, since that the original plans were to have Lincoln being paired with Gore Jordan, and since I made that a thing in my fanfiction, I think it really shows that I'm literally one of the only ones who actually want to see that happen in the show, after taking much time on which Lincoln ship I prefer the most. But less said about that, the better, because to tell you the truth, it has nothing to do with Chandler's development whatsoever. And no matter how I see it, with different perspectives of seeing more positives that overweigh the negatives from Jeers for feels, the Casagrandes fails from the Crypt is the better episode no matter what, especially when it's not trying to be the better episode. In rare occasions, the normal competitor, which is the Casagrandes episode, ended up outwitting the Loud House episode, which is the better competitor, when it came to it having a huge disadvantage when it comes to the future of that episode. You can really tell that the normal competitor can easily outwit something that they didn't intentionally do to make themselves better over the other. Granted, this has nothing to do with competition, but the more you think about it, the more you realize that the better competitor, which is the Loud House episode, can have a huge disadvantage when something comes in their way. And I'm saying this one more time, there was a lot more wrong with the episode than the phobias of Lincoln and Clyde. It's just my opinion. The only thing I'm looking forward to when it comes to a future Loud House vs. Casagrandes project by the end of this year or next year is mainly an episode centering around Chandler's character to a Casagrande character, to the point that the episodes being different from each other, the main comparison of them all is mainly Chandler and the Casagrandes character. I'm gonna keep it anonymous until the video comes out by the end of this year or next year, but believe me when I say this, there's a lot more to the video since I'm planning on reviewing that episode involving Chandler from Season 5, but that's literally all I'm gonna spoil for now. I'm giving Jeers for Feels a 6.5 out of 10, while Fails from the Crypt gets a 7.5 out of 10.